All right, here we are in section 2 of today's lecture. We are now diving into the Inca Empire, otherwise known to and by the Inca as Tahuantinsuyo. You can think about that middle part, that HUA as being a WAN, if that makes it easier to say. But Tahuantinsuyo is our focal point today, and this is the empire of the Inca. In this section, we're going to look at the way that this empire was not only constructed, but really bound together. And the Inca take this into an entirely new place. The way that they create and maintain an empire is different from anything seen up to this point in history across the Americas. So the Inca inhabited one of the most unique and fantastic landscapes in the world. They were in the Andes mountain range, which extends from north to south along the Pacific Ocean. It separates the desert coast from the Amazon jungle, and as it nears tropical latitudes, the equatorial warmth there allows access to living in much higher altitudes than it would anywhere else on the continent. This combination of factors really gave rise to a set of unique foods and animals that united the Inca around a common set of practices, a common set of foods, just as today you think about, Italian food, Italian people, Chinese food, Chinese people, even though what we eat as Italian food and Chinese food, of course, are bastardizations of what their origin is. Nonetheless, the Inca, in what is now not only modern day Peru, but Chile, Ecuador, parts of Bolivia, it expanded all along the southern coastline. There were a series of cultural touch points that bound them together. So here's a photo of some of the terrain where the Inca lived. Obviously not in those high glacial peaks, but those were always up above them. Just that, living in this mountain range changes your scope, right? Living on the plains, you have a different perspective physically for what you can see. Living in the mountains also shapes the human mind in a unique and fascinating way as well. The way it sees, the way it begins to shape an understanding of its land, its people. So we've looked at different primary commodity foods across cultures. Corn with the Olmec, cotton in Chavin, and amongst the Coral Supe people. Here, for the Inca, it was all about quinoa. Quinoa is one of these unique foods that really thrives at high altitudes. We've seen it come into vogue lately as a highly nutritious grain crop, right? That has this combination of both carbohydrates and protein. It's what makes us love it today, and it's what the Inca very literally thrived on. It was a primary part of their domestication and human consumption. Not only for them, but for the people surrounding Lake Titicaca, the basin of that lake, for around 3,000 to 4,000 years. Another traditional food or commodity is coca, which grows in the lower altitudes of the eastern slopes of the Andes. And coca is exactly what you think it is. It's the coca leaves that, when processed, when added chemical solvents, all this sort of like modern pharmaceutical rigmarole really becomes cocaine. But in its coca form, the leaves just contain a mild alkaloid. And they can be used for tea, or they can be chewed directly to alleviate altitude sickness. So it's partly a food, it's partly a medical device that allows people to live in the terrain they're in and to climb to great heights without getting quite as sick. People still use coca leaves. They still chew them today, particularly people who work in the mines. It is a very important tool. The 1980s North American crackdown on drugs had an impact on this that really was a detrimental one, because coca and cocaine are not the same, even if they have the same origin. All right, another series of, let's call them technologies for a second, that are super important for the Inca are the animals in their direct vicinity. And the Andes Mountains are populated by llamas, guanaco, alpaca, and vicuña, all of which are part of the camelid family. And you should see them climb up slopes. It is amazing. They're tiny little hooves. I've watched them scale things that you think they would just fall straight off these flat cliff faces. They're highly skilled and well adapted to this high mountainous terrain. For human purposes, they function both as pack animals to carry things over long distances, and of course, they can be eaten. In addition, they have a fine undercoat which can be used for weaving garments, and a coarse outer hair that can be spun and used for even warmer garments, which were really useful in the high altitudes of the Andes. And they're still used today. It's cold up there. We don't think about South America as being cold, but these are mountainous people. You saw that snow, you saw those glaciers. So here's a group of women in the Andes who are dyeing alpaca yarn. And here's what is done with it. It's woven into these beautiful, brilliantly covered tapestries, shawls, hats, clothing, everything that the people there wear. All right, so you read a little bit and listened quite a lot to the history of the Inca. And what we have is a series of takeovers, right? The Inca begin as a small, peripheral kind of kingdom, like the Mexica that we'll see next week when we look at Tenochtitlan. But they're just kind of a small group in a valley. They borrowed the Chimu's excuse me. They borrowed the Chimú approach to royalty, taking on the idea that the king who dies survives into the afterlife. And they took that up a notch. So, properly speaking, they bumped their king, their ruler, the Sapa Inca, up to the status of the divine. So the expansion and formation of this vast empire, and you can see here the different times in which the Inca conquest expanded the territory further and further and further, from those dark blue spots around Lake Titicaca to this vast, expansive territory. This happened really around 1438 with the rise of Pachacuti, who took the Inca from being kind of a small group of people to being expansionists, to being fully imperial and colonial, really, in the pure sense. The empire that Pachacuti began and that grew into this vast expanse that we see in the map here is what the people themselves called Tahuantinsuyo. And it means the 4 regions or divisions. And it's a reference to the way it was politically organized and divided. Okay, so the Inca began as a small group occupying a single valley, a single region in what's now Peru. And then around the 1400s, the Sapa Inca Pachacuti took things to a new level. He did this by, as I mentioned, a means that's novel to any other South American political scene at the time. Let's look at how he did this. The The consolidation of this massive empire was more or less complete by 1520. So 1430 to 1520, it's a little less than 100 years to go from that tiny region to this huge expanse. So few exceptional technologies are being put into play. And for the Inca, one of those was architecture, construction, and infrastructure building. It allowed them to thrive and to grow fast in a brief period before they were conquered and colonized by the Spanish, and then dramatically depopulated by disease. Okay, so how did this large empire hold together? They were able to control and rule by dominating their territory through pragmatic and religious means. On the pragmatic side, they had this incredible road system. They had accounting tools for keeping everything in order, knowing what's what, where, and how much of it, and it allowed them to keep records. This was pivotal. In terms of religion, the whole territory was organized through a system of beliefs that unified not only the people, but the landscape. We'll see how this works through a series of sacred sites. This idea of sacred stones that came up. In both instances, the road network and the sacred sites were integrated by careful design and really a carving of the land, igniting all of it, electrifying all of it under the rule of the Sapa Inca. Let's look at the individual technologies that were used. Okay, so number one, roads. The Incas had an extensive road network organized around what are called tambos and chasquis. You can see the chasqui here on the right, and you can see the incredible road system on the left, right? All the way from what is now Quito, Ecuador, down to Santiago in Chile, reaching into what is now Argentina. Just huge. This is a highway that runs a longer expanse than those that cross the United States now. And they were hand built, no machinery, and they were traveled on foot. There were no horses. In order to move quickly, the Inca came up with this fantastic system using chasqui, or messengers. Each chasqui carried a patutu, which is a trumpet made of a conch shell. You can see him blowing it there. And a quipu, which we'll look at in a second. It's a device which stored information, which kept accounts. And then the kepi on his back to hold objects that were going to be delivered from one site to the next. The chasquis worked using a relay system, which allowed them to convey messages over very long distances within a short time. I'm not exaggerating, just take a look. Here are the roads on the left. There are a series of intricate layers here that made this as solid and stable as possible. Look at what they're cutting through to make these roads. Just when you are on a highway and you see, the way that the mountainside has been cut away, the same thing is happening on a smaller and different scale, but in absolutely mountainous terrain here with the Inca's roads. On the right, we see a tambo, which is a structure along one of the roads used for storage. It's a temporary lodging place for the chasquis who are making this long distance trek. And it's also a place where records and accounting could be held, which meant it could be a storage site for the quipu, this device that we'll look at in a second, in which information was stored. Another really important technology in transportation for the time on foot were the construction of rope bridges. You've seen all the adventure movies where these rickety rope bridges span crazy valleys and from one cliff to another. And you can see that right here. This is a reconstructed Inca rope bridge. But nonetheless, this is a key mode of helping the chasquis get from one site to another more quickly. All right, how quickly? So the chasqui system allowed messages or goods to be delivered from Cusco, which you see down here in the south, to Quito within 1 week. All right, what does that mean? How do we put this in perspective? Google is saying it'll take 47 hours to drive that distance. 47 hours. It takes, I don't know, 26, 28 to drive from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States. Just to put that in perspective, it's a huge time-consuming drive. Okay, 47 hours by car. But of course, the Chaskeys were doing this on foot. They wouldn't have taken a coastal highway like we saw in the last Google map. They would have cut through the mountains, which would have looked something more like this. And you can see how long that would take on foot. Google says 591 hours. But the Chaskeys could cover that same distance in a week, meaning they took approximately 168 hours instead of 591. How did that happen? It happened because the Chaskeys would move from one tambo to the next. They make their long, fast trek from one lodging site to the next. When they arrive at that second lodging site, they're exhausted, they're wiped out. They hand their kipu over and their kepi, and a refreshed, well-tended to, well-slept Chasky takes over the next segment. So it's basically a relay race, right? One to the next, one to the next, one to the next. So the body is ever fresh. Whereas if you started and walked this, you're going to be exhausted as one person after 591 hours. So it's ingenious. It's smart. Someone came up with this. And we have seen this used around the world. All right, what is this kipu I'm talking about? This is what it looks like. The Incas use the kipu, sometimes called talking knots, as record-keeping devices for accounting and census purposes. A kipu consisted of colored, spun, and plied thread or strings from llama or alpaca hair, of course because of the animals in the region. It could be made of cotton as well. The cords contain numeric data, and other information could be encoded through the use of color, spacing, and structure on the kipu. It's not entirely clear how they did this, but it's a marvelous thing to hear explained in detail. So, okay, we've got roads, we've got bridges, we've got Chaskeys, we have the kipu to take notes, to really account for everything as if it were a book laying there full of information that's being recorded. And then on top of that, we have this wild system, really, of what are called huacas. Along this really carefully planned road network, these sacred spaces in the landscape were carved and set aside. What makes them sacred is a combination of things. One, these seats, really carved sitting areas made out of boulders, rocks, stones, were designated for the Sapa Inca, which really just means like the king Inca, the ruling Inca, to sit and rest along a long journey. Now, whether the Sapa Inca ever made these treks, it doesn't matter. The idea was that these were made for that divine ruler. You see a very elaborate one comparatively right here in front of you, a seat that honestly looks like a throne, looks like a large chair, right, where someone could rest. But they could be as humble as this. So along the routes, along these Inca roadways, topographical features like mountains, rivers, lakes, boulders, outcroppings, and caves, even springs, were activated as these sacred sites. I don't know how to even convey this, but like, okay, maybe if you've played Pokemon and suddenly the landscape that you always thought you knew, the city, the town, the area, has this whole other layer to it than you could see before. This sort of sacred making of everything around these people as they traveled is happening here in the landscape. It's almost as if everything just gets energized to a new level. And it unites the idea of the leader and the land, as if the leader is present in each one of these activated sites. It's a thing, I wish I could think of a better modern equivalent, but you can imagine that, right? Everything is just suddenly energized as part and extension of the Sapa Inca's body and domain and rule. So when one approached one of these sites, of course you could sit down and rest, but also what happens is that people are making offerings. Here you see a very simple coca leaf offering. These happened along these road sites. There's a famous huaca in the Cusco Cathedral, spectacular cathedral. Right inside that is a large rock, and it's known to be a huaca. The priests, of course, the Catholic priests were like, no, this doesn't work with us. We don't believe in this thing. And they wanted to get rid of that large huaca. The people resisted and protested. It still stands there today and shows this like amazing mixture, right, of the Inca tradition of the huacas and then the impositions of the empire of the Spanish and the Catholicism that they brought with them. The Inca approach to landscape in general was that it was enhanced by the touch of the Inca, right? It doesn't have to be in a spiritual way, but it's like carving a gem into a gemstone. And you can see how that takes place here. We're looking at agricultural terracing, a practice that continues to this day, but it is a heightening of the terrain, a refining of the terrain for use, for admiration, and for the indwelling of the Inca. Another way that they shaped, managed, and refined was through stone and water. The Incas were superb stonemasons, bar none the most precise and excellent masons that we've seen around the globe to this date. You can see here, and we'll look at it again next week, but you can see here the way that those stones fit together perfectly. Now, I'm not talking at the bottom two layers, but look at that third layer, or the second one down from the top, or the very top. It's almost as if this was like pressed concrete that had a form pressed into it. It's not. There's a lot of weird speculation on the internet, but studies have been done of this stone, and it is discrete stone. So, okay, the carving is impeccable, and it allows for construction in the landscape that there's no seepage. Nothing's getting through that the Inca who have designed and built it don't want to get through. On the other hand, they had really sophisticated hydraulic systems. So canals could be routed from natural springs and then directed into neighboring cities, sites, agricultural reserves. And you can see that happening here. This is water coming from a stream up at the top that has been channeled through this series of terraces down to the bottom where it was meant to be. It travels from here again underground and comes out at another site. So this very elaborate land shaping really, was mobilized as a political agent. And Inca architecture was so advanced and particular that its presence signaled the Inca presence, just as we said with the huacas. But right, we're here. Look at us. This is what we're doing. We have made our mark on the territory in a literal and infrastructural way. The Inca Empire stopped where it did because expanding to the east would have moved up into even higher altitudes of the Andes, or in the lower regions, one started to enter the Amazon jungle. And it just wasn't a place where the Inca were confident in how to really terraform the earth, right? They knew how to work with stone. They knew how to reroute water. They didn't know how to work with jungle. And that limited their expansion. So that wraps up our part one of the Inca Empire. We looked at a bit on Chimú earlier in this section and the way that this idea of religion, right, the idea of kings persisting past their death influenced the architecture of those citadels. You couldn't just take one over. That belonged to a king who was living in a slightly different realm, but who needed to still be taken care of on Earth in their citadel. So another one needed to be built. Here with the Inca, something else is happening, right? We will get into the very sacred sites and capital cities involved. But today we've looked at the way that roads, infrastructure, messengers, and a real heightening of the land itself under the umbrella of Inca rule was used to really bring people together. And how hydraulic engineering, incredible stonemasonry really helped the Inca make an even deeper mark than just homesteads, for example. We'll continue with this at the next class. Thanks for listening. Send me a few notes on Slack to let me know what stood out for you. Particularly, tell me about some imagery that you've seen in these slides. All right, just 2 or 3 responses on anything of interest to you will be great. All right, take care.